The sign of a good story is its ability to excite the imagination. And when it comes to the Final Fantasy franchise, one of the stories that has excited the imaginations of players more than most is Final Fantasy VIII. Countless theories have been crafted over the years, all with certain elements that make them seem plausible, but there always needs to be at least a good base. Final Fantasy VIII, due to how the plot was structured, offered so much for people to work with in this regard, as there was a ton of backstory that was woven in. Characters like Laguna, Edea and Adele had an incredible aura about them due to a combination of their presence in the past, but also their actions in the present. And this was then complemented by the younger generation, who were attempting to not be afraid, find their way, and never look back. It's at this point that I should say that this video serves as part 4 of our detailed look into the unabridged timeline of Final Fantasy VIII. If you're new, we therefore encourage you to go back and check out the previous parts as they delve into the creation of the world and its earlier civilizations, while exploring the rise of Vinzadeling and Adele, how the Sorceress War came to be, and then how it concluded. If you'd like to check them out, there are links in the description below. We've thoroughly enjoyed diving into the story of Final Fantasy VIII though, but with 2.5 hours of content already produced, we're now ready to start talking about Squall and the main events of the game, while showing how everything ties together and then concludes. So please, sit back and enjoy as we conclude the complete unabridged timeline of Final Fantasy VIII. Oh, and be sure to stick around until the end, as we have an important question that we need your help answering. Chapter 7. The Seed is Planted. After the establishment of Garden, things had not quite gone to plan for Cid, but he was at least still present. This meant that even though he had limited control, he could still loosely oversee the recruitment and teaching of its students, and serve as a guiding hand as they made their way through the different stages of development, from new recruit to seed and even instructor. Edea, however, was having a very different experience. Having left Cid to manage the founding of Garden, she and a selection of orphans from the orphanage continued their nomadic life, as a way of avoiding the prying eyes of anyone who might be looking to seek them, or more specifically, Elone, out. With little else available to pass the time, Edea continued to serve as teacher and matron to the children, but there was a slight change to the curriculum. Due to their change in circumstance, this saw Edea teach the orphans how to properly run and maintain the ship, while also helping them to learn where food and supplies could be gathered without the need for constant trips back to the civilized world. This was then layered underneath the main syllabus. As the Seed program had found its legs under Cid's direction, Edea too began to train orphans under her protection. But whereas Cid had been forced to cede responsibilities, Edea was not limited in her scope. As the highest authority on the mobile orphanage, with no contact to the outside world, Edea had no financial benefactor to appease like Norg in Balam and Trabia Garden, and no government to compromise with like Galbadia Garden. Edea was free to train the older orphans on the ship in the way that she saw fit, and she took advantage of this unique position by assigning them with one of the most important missions of all. Indoctrinating them with strict ideals, philosophies and training principles that she believed were core to the concept of Seed serving as an anti-sorceress force, this force were to serve as the first line of defense against a sorceress uprising, an elite unit separate and independent from the Seed operatives trained as part of the Garden program. The grim reality of the situation was thus: Edea herself was a sorceress. Should her powers ever grow to the point where she was no longer able to control them, this made her a potential target of Seed. As such, the training she led aboard the mobile orphanage focused heavily on not only self-preservation and combat, but also how to defeat and deal with Edea herself, should the day ever arrive when she became a problem to those around her. Though ideally, they all hoped this somber function never materialized, Edea made sure to imprint on her trainees the severity of her conviction in their purpose. The encounter with Ultimecia had thoroughly scarred her, and while it was hard to train the impressionable children aboard the mobile orphanage in the ways of war against her and others of her kind, Adia knew it would be the only way to ensure the success of the mission she and Sid had undertaken. Thus, the elite group of seeds known as the White Seeds were born, and in turn, the mobile orphanage became their base of operations, known as the White Seed Ship. They did, however, have another task. In addition to being trained in anti-sorceress combat, the White Seed operatives were tasked with protecting Alone from the advances of Odin and any other individuals who sought her power for nefarious means. And as the White Seed did not double as a mercenary force for hire like the Seed operatives from the Gardens, they were able to fully devote themselves to their mission objectives, a fact which brought Adia some modicum of comfort, as they were the only vanguard that stood between her and Alone and the rest of the world. Back at Balam Garden, Sid's stewarding of Seed was progressing well despite his diminished control. The first generation contained some of the younger children from the orphanage who were not considered to be part of the White Seed and were not adopted. But they also opened up admissions to the surrounding area, and this brought in a mixture of older and younger children. Part of Garden's plan was to use these older students as mentors to the younger ones, as they were able to grasp the fundamentals of Seed more quickly. The goal was that eventually some of these older students would become proper instructors or even lead Seed operatives in the field, and one such example of this initiative was a girl called Shu. Owing to her proficiency in combat and general maturity, Shu was quick to progress within Garden. She ended up as a figure that many of the younger students looked up to, and after being promoted to the role of instructor, she oversaw Seed field examinations and was extremely competent in her role. Alongside the other older students and early Seed graduates, Shu helped to shape Balam Garden into the place that the younger children grew up in, and this included a small selection from the orphanage. But not all of these children joined Garden straight away. While it was true that many were enrolled early on, Sid and Adia still technically ran an orphanage, and as such, many of the children who were under their care did see themselves adopted by caring families in the years that followed the conclusion of the Sorceress War. The rambunctious Zell was adopted by the Dinkt family in Balam Town and grew up with his mother in the seaside village. Staying at home with her throughout the remainder of his early childhood, Zell eventually enrolled in Balam Garden at the age of 13, having been inspired by his grandfather, who had been a soldier. But it was also seen as a way of putting some of his overflowing energy to good use while instilling a sense of discipline. Quistis, who had taken the role of older sister following the departure of Alone from the orphanage, was also adopted. But unfortunately for her, the story didn't pan out quite the same way it did for Zell. Things did not work with her adoptive family, and this left Quistis with nowhere to turn other than Garden. She ended up enrolling at the age of 10, and perhaps due to the trauma of the failed adoption, she focused all of her energies on her studies, advancing quickly through the curriculum and displaying an adeptness for paramagic-based combat. By the age of 15, Quistis had become one of the youngest students to pass the Seed field examination, joining the ranks of the older Seed operatives. 2 years later, when she was 17, she became an instructor, once again exceeding all expectations. But beyond this being a huge honour, it saw history repeat itself, as Quistis once again found herself in the big sister mentorship role to many of the other students at Balam Garden. Other children from the orphanage also joined the Garden system, although not all found their ways to Balam. Selphie, one of the younger children, was not particularly well suited for combat, and thus was sent to the satellite Trabia Garden for her training. Here she quickly found her footing even at a young age, and after passing her foundational courses by the age of 17 had transferred to Balam Garden as a promising Seed candidate. Likewise, Irvine was sent to Galbadia Garden. He had displayed a very developed sense of compassion and a high degree of emotional intelligence, but also displayed an aptitude for firearms. To foster this, and possibly as a part of General Caraway's larger plan to build up the Galbadian military with elite recruits, Irvine was selected to study at Galbadia Garden, an undertaking he excelled at. Most notably, the two children who did enroll at Balam Garden straight away were Squall and Cypher, who joined the Seed candidate program as soon as they were able. Ever the troublemakers back at the orphanage, and especially since Alone had left, these two had a special place in Sid and Adia's hearts, and Sid, for his part, wanted to keep them both close and under his watchful eyes. One of the most important aspects of being part of the SEED candidate program was the studying of combat, and in this regard, a crucial decision was the weapon of choice. This determined so much about progression, as shown by Irvine ending up at Galbadia. Candidates could select from a wide range, and when Cypher had his turn, he chose with his heart. He was one of the kids that had been inspired by Laguna's movie, where he fought off the Red Dragon with a gunblade, and this determined his choice, despite the weapon being notoriously difficult to master. Whether it was out of jealousy or competition, or both, Squall then chose the same weapon. As they were the only candidates who chose the gunblade as their specialised weapon, the rivalry that already existed between the two intensified as constant comparisons were made. While friendly competition could have been a boon to both their educations and developments, unbeknownst to them though, Squall had been earmarked for special treatment, and this further poisoned the relationship as the pair grew up. Prior to founding Garden, Adia had told Sid of her encounter with Ultimecia and a young adult version of Squall from the future. This event, as the genesis point for the creation of Garden, established Squall as the focal point of all of Sid and Adia's efforts for Garden and SEED, as Sid knew that he had to do whatever he could to prepare Squall for the role he was one day required to play. The consequence of this action, though unintentional, was that despite showing plenty of raw talent and being at least an equal to Squall, Cypher was often overlooked and held back by comparison. He was already a rambunctious and damaged child, but this favouritism then compounded Cypher's ever-darkening worldview. With no real values or role models to cling to outside of just doing what they were told, Cypher tried to define for himself what it meant to be a SEED. And this often led to him seeking his own path and rebelling as opposed to following the path that was expected of him. Cypher often believed he was doing the right thing, but frequently found himself disciplined. By comparison, Squall seemed to be able to do no wrong, and this caused the rift between the two to only widen, as Cypher continued to act out, with Squall and the other students often catching the brunt of his outbursts. Squall, however, neither wanted nor appreciated this attention, and found Garden to be a difficult place. Not wanting to socialise or be part of a team, he began to retreat within himself, coming off as trying to be cool and aloof to others. As if to further polarise the pair, even though Cypher had his problems, he still had friends, in the form of Fujin and Raijin, while Squall developed none. In many ways, this was a continuation of the tumultuous relationship they had at the orphanage, except Squall no longer had Alone to act as a peacekeeper. But the regression in their relationship was further exacerbated by a feature of Balam Garden that was not seen at either Trabia or Galbadia, the junctioning of Guardian forces. As further refinement took place around Dr. Odin's studies into the mysterious extra-dimensional beings known as Guardian forces and subsequently paramagic, the technology allowed users to not only channel Guardian Force beings in order to cast magic, but also to summon them in combat as powerful allies. This made Guardian Forces an extremely potent weapon for SEED operatives, a literal game changer when out in the field. This power, however, came at a price. Junctioning Guardian Forces required the user to allow the beings to take up a space in their brain, and as a result, they began to lose their memories upon prolonged use of junctioning. Possibly obtaining access to this advanced Astarian research through Norg's connections prior to the end of the Sorceress War, or perhaps seeking them out on his own, Sid grappled with the decision to greenlight their use by SEED operatives. But despite seeing the negative effect it had on the children he used to care for back at the orphanage, with many forgetting their former friends and lives completely, he still ultimately approved their use, knowing that without Guardian forces, SEED stood no chance as skilled mercenaries, let alone as anti-sorceress specialists. They needed the power to level the playing field. That being said, Sid did make sure to limit the use of the controversial technology. It meant Guardian forces were only sanctioned for use at Balam Garden, which meant students of Trabia and Galbadia were not given access, barring a transfer to Balam. This allowed Sid to have some control over the immense power on offer by Guardian forces, but isolated incidents still occurred, such as when a young Selphie encountered a Guardian force in the wilds of Trabia in her youth and junctioned it briefly, causing her to suffer memory loss even with such limited exposure. As the various instances of Garden flourished under their individual directors, the rest of the world continued to change, and in the power vacuum that followed Adele's defeat, Vinzerdelling's Galbadia only grew more emboldened. Suddenly, there were no contenders for the role of world's most powerful military, and Esther's policy of seclusion suited Delling's plans perfectly at the time. If Esther was going to stay out of world affairs, then there was no one to stop him from taking whatever he wanted. Thus, in the years that followed the Sorceress War, Galbadia took to finishing the job they had started with Timber and Windhill, continuing to consolidate their power on the western continent through the further expansion of their territory and the occupation of even more settlements. Though this conquest was not absolute. The city-state of Dolet, that housed the last remnants of the Holy Empire of Dolet, for instance, remained independent, as did Balam. And in the case of the latter, the opening of Balam Garden and its affiliation with Galbadia Garden made any attempt to broaden their reach to the central continent more complicated. Nonetheless, Vinzerdelling was not going to let these trivial matters curtail the huge wave of success he was seeing, with his popularity now at an all-time high. Even though he had played almost no part in the resolution of the Sorceress War, the citizenry were ignorant to this fact. So Delling pulled every political and military string he had to solidify his power and appoint himself, either through manipulation or force, as the president of Galbadia for life. And this brought an end to any semblance of democratic process that may have existed in Galbadia. It was now a full-on dictatorship. Helping in Delling's ascension to absolute power was none other than General Caraway, whose own further descent into totalitarian ideology had begun to frustrate his daughter, Rinoa. With Julia no longer around, Rinoa was cared for by a mixture of people and brought up in a life of relative comfort. After all, she was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in all of Galbadia. But as she gained more exposure to her father, she saw how he used people and treated not just his fellow Galbadians, but also those in the newly occupied territories. He treated them with a lack of respect. This was at odds with her character, and as the years passed, she grew to resent her father. And this divide only continued to grow as Rinoa entered her teenage years and wanted to rebel. Such was the extremeness of her rebellious nature that Rinoa decided to travel the continent to see the depths of her father's depravity. And it was while visiting Timber that Rinoa learnt about the various anti-Galbadian resistance circles that existed. Rinoa chose to move to Timber on a semi-permanent basis, so as to not antagonize her father too much, but she quickly found her way into the Timber independence movement through an organization known as the Forest Owls. Built on the back of the original Timber resistance and featuring the children of many of the core members who had lost their lives in the Galbadian occupation, such as Zone and Watts, it was here that Rinoa finally found the community she had been searching for her whole life. But it also served as the perfect foil to allow her to seek revenge against her father in a way that was mutually beneficial to her and Timber. On the surface, Rinoa didn't offer much. She was just a rich kid with no experience of the kind of oppression that the people in the occupied territories had been forced to endure. But due to her father's position, she did have intimate knowledge of the Galbadian hierarchy, and this proved to be very valuable. Having been stationed in Timber for some time, it was here that Rinoa first met Cypher, who at the time was still training to be a seed. The pair found they had a lot in common, especially when it came to their sentiments around anti-establishmentarianism. They both had people or organizations that they wanted to rebel against, and based on this, they hit it off. Indeed, Rinoa and Cypher got on so well that they entered into a brief relationship, and it was due to this relationship that Rinoa did what she did best: gather intelligence that may be valuable. Through Cypher, she learnt about the role of Seed as a military organization for hire. But even though Rinoa soon left Delling City for good, moving to Timber on a permanent basis as a way to get away from her father's influence, the relationship with Cypher didn't last and they mutually separated. After moving to Timber, Rinoa was able to serve the Forest Owls on a permanent basis, and she used the information she'd gathered to pitch a new plan. She proposed that the Forest Owls use Seed operatives to augment their capabilities and execute on bigger and bigger schemes aimed at destabilizing the Galbadian occupation of Timber. The other members were convinced, but they had limited funds and nowhere near enough to be able to afford the services of Seed. Still, Rinoa vowed to travel to Balam, hoping to use her previous connection with Cypher to gain a meeting with Sid, so as to plead their case. She hoped that he would take pity on their situation and offer aid regardless. In reality, even though the Forest Owls had strong ideologies, they underestimated the uphill battle they faced. Even with the help of Seed operatives, fighting back against Galbadia was a tall and nearly impossible order. This notion was only further compounded by what Delling did next. With no grand opponents for Galbadia to do war with, Delling made sure to adapt his wartime presidential style and repurposed it as a full-fledged military dictatorship. With this new paradigm, all aspects of life for the Galbadian people and its conquered territories were controlled by the military. This saw the army act as both police and national defense, and this then made the highest-ranking officials some of the most influential people in the country, even if their only job was to be yes-men to President Delling. Galbadia's propaganda campaigns, put into overdrive during the Sorceress War, continued after the war, and helped them to control their conquered territories, keeping anti-Galbadian sentiments to a minimum where possible. Capital punishment and torture were frequently used against political dissidents, and captured resistance fighters and many on the Western continent settled into a way of life where safety came at the price of not questioning the military and keeping your head down. As a result, in the nearly 2 decades following Adele's demise, the world enjoyed a tense period of relative peace. Sorceresses were made into a taboo subject, with those that experienced the war firsthand still very much around, opting to put their faith in Delling's military to ensure they were never troubled again. Still, the process of embodiment continued as it always had, and it could be assumed that new sorceresses were created in secret, away from the eyes of the public and the powers that be. But due to popular opinion being quite soured on the concept of sorceresses, this pushed those unlucky enough to receive the magic of a sorceress, such as Adia Kramer, to the outskirts of society, victims of the millennia-long vicious cycle of public opinion against them. As a result, in the interceding years following the Sorceress War, the very idea of sorceresses began to fade into the back of the public's memory. But still, the feeling of unease around the topic lingered, and the world was soon about to find out that the sorceress threat Sid and Adia were attempting to prepare for was both very real and much closer to the inception of the Seed project than they could have ever expected. Chapter 8. A new sorceress appears. Early on in the process of developing Seed, Sid and Adia had made a purposeful choice to divide their efforts. As much as they wanted to stay together, the pair knew that because Adia was herself a sorceress, her involvement in the public side of the initiative was too fraught with risk. That's why the White Seed ship was such an important part of the plan. As Adia trained her charges, everybody aboard the ship began to settle into the seafaring way of life, with strong bonds formed amongst the crew. Everyone became comfortable, and though they remained vigilant as the threat to Alone being abducted was still quite a real possibility, they began to become desensitized to the other possibility, that Adia, their surrogate parent and teacher, may turn on them. Many believed that Adia's fears were unfounded, but this proved to be naive. Without warning, the event that Adia had feared most occurred, as she was possessed by Ultimecia, the very sorceress from the future who had appeared before her alongside School all those years ago. Ever since Adia had accepted Ultimecia's power back at the orphanage, she had been acutely aware of the terrible power that came to exist during an unspecified time in the future. Though she hid it well, by participating in the embodiment process with Ultimecia and accepting her lineage of power, Adia had inadvertently flirted with an advanced magic that had the potential to destroy the world. It was this very power that she had trained the White Seed to be vigilant against. But no matter how well prepared the White Seed were, none could have known the true depth of Ultimecia's ability or ambition. Having grown up in a future that featured a warped version of Seed, Ultimecia and her kind were hunted down indiscriminately. The principles first extolled by Adia and Sid had become twisted over time. Instead of focusing on defending against sorceresses who attempted to use their powers to harm others, all sorceresses were deemed dangerous, lest they be the one that delivered on the prophecy to bring about a cataclysmic event. Ultimecia had never asked for the life she ended up with, and she had no choice but to grow up in a world that forced her to hide who she was. Over time, the fear of being captured transformed her into something else. A hatred for Seed had developed, as had a want and a need to end the persecution. Ultimecia was aware of parts of the Seed doctrine, and the one part she was acutely aware of was that one single legendary Seed operative was the one who would save the world from the supposed evil Sorceress. None of the sorceresses who existed knew if they were to be the one to suffer this fate, but Ultimecia decided to take matters into her own hands. She would be the one to determine how her life played out, not some accursed seed or some twisted prophecy. To this end, she sought to use the ultra-powerful magic known as time compression to condense all of time to a single point. This would allow her to embody the power of several sorceresses from across the ages. Using this combined power, Ultimecia then planned to use her newfound power to revert all of existence back to its origin point, and, like Hein had in the ancient times, create the world anew, with her as the supreme ruler, and Seed nowhere to be found. Unfortunately for Ultimecia though, executing this plan was not within the realm of possibility. Though she believed achieving time compression was theoretically achievable, she lacked the means to actually cast the spell, as it involved casting from multiple points in time, both where she was, in the future, but also far enough back into the past. As a studious individual, Ultimecia kept searching for answers to her problem, and it was through extensive research that she discovered some historical texts relating to the works of a scientist called Dr. Odin. These texts, which depicted a completed version of a device known as the junction machine alone, gave Ultimecia insight into not only the machine's ability to send an individual into the past through the consciousness of another, but also Alone herself, and by extension, her connection to Edea. Ultimecia was ecstatic that she had found the answer to her problem, and quickly set about completing her own version of the machine, but there was still one major wrinkle. The junction machine alone she constructed could only go back so far into the past, and she needed to go back further for the casting of time compression to work. And for that reason, she would need the real alone, not some cheap imitation. In addition to this problem, the junction machine alone only allowed one to view the past through someone else's eyes. Ultimecia was unsure if she would be able to actually affect the past in a way that would allow her to cast time compression. Still, she had to try, so went ahead with her plan unfazed, and knowing of Edea, her connection to Alone, and Edea's status as a sorceress, she used the junction machine alone to travel into the past and enter Edea's mind, hoping to learn how she might be able to manipulate Alone into giving her access to the ability firsthand. Unbeknownst to Ultimecia though, Edea was part of the same sorceress lineage, having been granted access via the embodiment process when the future version of Ultimecia had perished. It was perhaps for this reason that the power offered by the junction machine alone manifested in a different form. As instead of simply occupying Edea's consciousness and being able to observe events as they played out, Ultimecia was able to possess her subject. This was an unexpected boon, and Ultimecia believed she could use Edea to manipulate Alone more easily. However, not everything went according to this new plan. Though Ultimecia was indeed successful in her using of the junction machine alone on Edea, Edea was a formidable sorceress in her own right, not least because she possessed Ultimecia's own power. As such, even though Edea was not able to fight off the physical side of the possession, she was able to fight off the mental side. Edea realized that the danger she always feared was now at her doorstep. By fighting, she closed off her mind and her memories. This prevented Ultimecia from gaining access to critical information regarding both who Alone was, and more importantly, where she was, and thus this brought Alone and the White Seed some much needed time to act accordingly. Training from a young age for such a scenario, the White Seed were able to notice almost immediately that Edea was acting strangely, but they continued to act as if nothing was wrong, creating an illusion that was able to fool Ultimecia, but only for a limited period. Realizing that time was of the essence, they set a course for the shore to gain supplies, but this was merely a ruse to allow Alone to disembark without raising suspicion. Once this gambit had played out, the White Seed that remained were then given the perilous task of keeping an incredibly frustrated and violently possessed Edea occupied, leading her on a wild goose chase while Alone and a small contingent of White Seeds made for Balam Garden, but they hoped that Sid would be able to raise the alarm and activate Seed proper. It did not take long for Ultimecia to realize that she had been led astray. The White Seed were unhelpful in her search for a loan, and with no point of reference for who she actually was or what she looked like, attempting to find this girl was akin to finding a needle in a haystack. The solution to this problem was to find someone who could actually help. It did not take long for Ultimecia to surmise that to maximize her chances of success, she needed to cast the widest net possible and make use of all available resources. This required enlisting the services of the world's major powers, and her first target was none other than the world's most powerful nation, Vinzerdelling's Galbadia. At this time, the people of Galbadia had settled into the peace that followed the fall of Adele and Esther, and those who had participated in the Sorceress War were now some of the more elderly statesmen and women of society. It therefore took many by surprise when an unknown woman appeared from nowhere and catapulted herself into the upper echelons of Galbadia's political circle. Plenty of feathers were rustled, but this woman seemed to have a knack for gaining the favour of just the right people. And it didn't take long for her to gain the favour of the right person, the president himself. And this was something that bothered many of those who were also desperate for his attention. When it was revealed that this woman was a sorceress, red flags shot up everywhere. But with Delling seemingly under her thumb, there was nothing they could do, as they were fearful of speaking out against his authority and risking his wrath. Even General Caraway, Delling's most trusted advisor, was sidelined by this new arrangement, and led to him and other members of Delling's top military brass eyeing the new development with extreme caution. They feared that the sorceress had gained too much influence over Delling and that she was already starting to manipulate and affect his decision-making. This manifested via small decisions, but soon Delling made a decision that confirmed everything they suspected. To Ultimecia, Galbadia was just a small step towards a greater goal. She desired the combined knowledge of everything, and used the power and influence of Galbadia to fashion a plan whereby the most powerful world leaders would gather together in one place via the promise of peace and cooperation. The reality, however, was quite the opposite. Once congregated, Ultimecia planned to manipulate all of them into using their resources to help her find a loan, giving her nowhere to hide. To ensure this message of peace was convincing, Ultimecia wanted to broadcast her intention on a global scale, something that she knew would put pressure on the various leaders to comply. But the only way to accomplish this was to take a bold action that Delling had refused to take for over 20 years: embark on a new military conquest. After the Holy Empire of Dolet dissolved, they retreated to the Dolet Dukedom, where they established a huge communications tower to show their willingness to be part of the wider network forged on community and cooperation. The tower operated for a short time, but after the launching of Adele's tomb into space, its long-range broadcasting capabilities were rendered obsolete, or at least that was the official story. The unofficial story was that the technology used to try and contain Adele had interfered with that form of communication, and despite her supposedly dormant state, she had managed to hijack its function and had begun broadcasting her own message. With everyone around the world wanting to believe that Adele was no more, it was agreed that this message should never be seen, and the easiest way to accomplish this was to cease all communication using that medium unless absolutely necessary. Ultimecia was oblivious to all of this subtext, and irrespective of whether Delling made her aware, the Galbadian military were ordered to draw up plans for the invasion of Dolet and the reactivation of its communication tower. She wanted the broadcast made, and this was the only way to do it. As Galbadia put its plans into action on the western continent, Elone then attempted to do the same on the central continent. Having found her way to Balam Garden, Elone was able to meet with Sid. However, the news she received was unexpected. Despite the sorceress threat emerging, Garden, and more specifically Seed, were unable to assist, at least not in the way Elone had helped. The Dolet Dukedom, owing to their natural fortifications, assumed that Galbadia was going to leave them well alone and had not prepared for the eventuality where their sovereignty was actually challenged. When Galbadia appeared at their doorstep, it meant they were ill-equipped to defend themselves and sent words to Balam Garden asking for immediate assistance. They were desperate and had nowhere to turn. Garden seldom received requests of this nature, not least because their opponent in this instance was the Galbadian Empire, who had a direct affiliation with Galbadia Garden. But Norg was only too happy to oblige Dolet's request for aid due to the very lucrative contract he was able to negotiate. This decision therefore tied Sid's hands, as it was near impossible to even attempt to broach the subject of mobilizing Seed to deal with the rise of a new sorceress when such a large-scale contract was in effect. But part of Sid was also glad, as even though he knew the day might come, he still did not want to order the death of his wife and partner. As Seed prepared to honour the contract, Sid therefore had no choice but to put the conversation with the loan to the back of his mind and focus on the task at hand, ensuring Sid were ready to tackle this contract head-on while utilising it to ensure the next generation was still being trained according to the agreed-upon values and standards. Amongst the roster of potential Seed, there were plenty of standout candidates, but two of the most important were Squall and Cypher. Both had been challenging themselves to progress under the watchful eye of Sid, but neither had managed to progress at the same rate as Quistis. In fact, even though the pair had been at Balam Garden for some time, they were not too far ahead of the other Seed candidates, such as Selphie and Zell, who had joined Balam Garden much later in life. It wasn't really a skill problem though. Sid struggled to keep them focused, as Squall couldn't help be distracted by Cypher and vice versa. And this petty rivalry was on full display right when Sid needed them to be focused, as the greatest threat of their lives, and indeed the greatest threat to the very existence of the world, loomed on the horizon. As Sid wrestled with the news of Adia's possession and the Galbadian invasion of Dolet, he also received news that Squall and Cypher had been at it again, taking part in a clandestine duel off campus. As usual, neither was willing to back down, and both ended up in the infirmary, with permanent scars as a reminder of the stalemate that had occurred yet again. Sid was unwilling to deal with such ill behaviour at such a time though. He needed everyone firing on full cylinders. The contract from Dolet required everyone to be involved. Balam Garden was to mobilise not only their top Seed operatives, but also the Seed candidates who had undergone all their basic training, the prerequisite tests, and were ready to take their field examination proper. In a usual examination, candidates would be deployed alongside Seed field instructors and operatives in a low-risk, live combat environment to test their abilities and evaluate if they were ready to graduate. But in the case of Zell, Cypher, Selphie and Squall, who had only just completed his final test at the nearby fire cavern and was still healing from his training injury, the full-scale deployment of Seed to Dolet was to serve as their first taste of real combat, and the stakes were high, both for Dolet and Balam Garden. After a short briefing from Shu, Seed launched a daring beach assault on Dolet's shoreline meant to catch Galbadia unawares, and using this strategy they were able to have some initial success, securing a safe perimeter around the city centre. But Seed were only able to act on intelligence supplied to them by Dolet, and they were none the wiser as to why Galbadia was even invading in the first place. It was only due to the rogue actions of Cypher, who had been designated as a team leader, that the true objectives of Galbadia were uncovered. Breaking from official orders, Cypher decided to follow a group of Galbadian operatives who managed to sneak through the perimeter established by Seed. But even though they were successful in uncovering the truth about the incursion, they were unsuccessful in their attempts to stop Galbadian forces from rebooting the communications tower. And after being given the order to withdraw, for their troubles they ended up being chased through the streets of Dolet by an experimental mechanized weapon, only managing to escape the combat zone safely due to the intervention of Quistis and a high-caliber machine gun. After returning to Garden, the mission to save Dolet was considered a success, with their objective accomplished. Galbadia agreed to withdraw its troops on the proviso that they were granted continued access to the communications tower. Balam Garden, for its part in the conflict, was handsomely rewarded, and Zell, Selphie, Squall, and another candidate named Nida had performed so well during the Seed exam that they were granted the status of full Seed operatives. Cypher, however, was cast aside, reprimanded for disobeying direct orders, despite his actions allowing them to learn more about why Galbadia had chosen to invade in the first place. With everyone seemingly getting what they wanted from the skirmish, the status quo was re-established, and the new Seed graduates were given the night to bask in the glory of their success. But this only turned out to be a facade, as pieces were continuing to move around the ever-evolving chessboard. Rinoa, through Cypher, had managed to secure an audience with Sid and was a formal guest at the Seed graduation ball. She had hoped to see Cypher, but due to his failure during the examination, he was nowhere to be found. Not wanting to be alone at such an event, Rinoa sought out a new partner, and after noticing a young man who'd gazed upon the same shooting star as her, she saw an opportunity and went on the charm offensive. She hoped some flattery would work, But after her advances were rebuffed, Rinoa decided she was not going to take no for an answer, and ended up forcefully dragging Squall onto the dance floor, which is where they stayed until Rinoa saw Sid and walked off to speak about their situation. Rinoa was desperate for help, but unfortunately had little to offer in terms of compensation. Sid, though, was moved by Rinoa's passionate pleas and decided to grant her access to 3 new Seed graduates until either Timber gained independence or they were all killed. But there was an ulterior motive. Sid wanted to get Squall out of Garden, so that he was mobile in the world and less likely to be drafted into one of Norg's contracts. After hearing the news, Rinoa was overjoyed, and the next morning she was excited to meet her new team. Part of her was hoping that Cypher had been selected, but she soon learned that Cypher had failed to pass the Seed examination and was ineligible. Nonetheless, Rinoa was pleasantly surprised to see that the young man she'd accosted the night before was part of the team. Perhaps she'd get to have some fun after all. Eager to show the members of Seed that the Forest Owls meant business, despite their humble headquarters, Rinoa talked about their upcoming plans to kidnap Vinzadelling. She hoped to deploy some of the tactics she'd learned from her father, and everything did go according to her plan, except for one thing. She had not accounted for President Delling using a decoy. As it turned out, the real president was already in Timber and was planning to use their TV station, as it was the only one equipped to do broadcast by radio waves. And, by using the newly acquired communication tower in Dolet, Delling planned to broadcast Ultimecia's plan of peace talks to the entire world. Not to be deterred, Rinoa decided to craft a new plan. She would head to the TV station and hijack the planned broadcast, using it to spread their own message to the world about their situation. Squall, however, was fed up by this point. Having now become a Seed, he had expected to be assigned to be part of high-end military campaigns, not unlike the Dolet mission, working alongside some of the best operatives in the world. Instead, he'd been forced to assist a bunch of amateurs. Their goals were noble, but Squall was not paid to care about such things. If the Forest Owls had the appropriate funding and skills to enact their plans, Squall would have been more than happy to support them. But they didn't. So Squall made Rinoa aware in no uncertain terms that he was embarrassed to even be associated with them. Such chiding marks led Rinoa to scrap the contract she had with Seed before subsequently retreating from their location, unable to watch as Delling prepared to give his world-changing speech. Squall, however, stayed to watch with Selphie and Zell. Delling began the speech with his customary charm, as he explained his ambition to host a global peace conference so that the various nations of the world could hash out their differences. Everything was going according to Ultimecia's plan, but just as Delling was about to declare Adia as Galbadia's representative in the upcoming peace talks, broadcast was interrupted by an unexpected third party. After failing his Seed examination, Cypher was disciplined accordingly. After all, he had defied a direct order and put his squad in unnecessary danger before then abandoning them. He had been blinded by his own ego yet again. But this time, there were real consequences to his actions. And alongside failing to pass the Seed exam, it meant Cypher was prohibited from aiding Rinoa in her quest to free Timber from its subjugation. This frustrated him no end, because even though 3 Seed had been assigned to Rinoa, he knew that none of them had the stomach to do what truly needed to be done. War was ugly, and they just weren't prepared. This assertion turned out to be true. Galbadia outfoxed Seed, who then managed to weasel their way out of the lifetime contract Sid had committed them to. As a consequence, Cypher felt he had to take matters into his own hands. He needed to show Rinoa how much he cared for her and her cause, while also showing Squall that he was the superior operative. Acting on impulse, as he always did, Cypher abandoned the mission he had been assigned to alongside Quistis and stormed the Timber TV station. With the cameras still rolling, he then took President Delling hostage. But Cypher's Achilles heel then came to the fore. He hadn't thought this through. There was no next part of the plan, and it was at that moment that Cypher realised that perhaps taking the President of Galbadia hostage during a live broadcast to the entire world may have far-reaching consequences, and that the protection Garden had afforded him over these years was no longer there. Quistis, for her part, attempted to take stock of the situation and requested that any Seed operatives that were nearby should come to their aid. But this, and subsequent exchanges, enabled the calm and collected Delling to deduce who was responsible for this reprehensible act, promising swift retaliation. As the scene continued to unfold, Cypher realised his options were becoming more and more limited. He was in a mad panic. But it was here that Ultimecia sensed an opportunity. Her initial plan was now dead in the water. There was no way that the other nations in the world would agree to come to peace talks when their own broadcast had suffered such a significant security breach. But perhaps she could use this young, impressionable renegade to do her dirty work, and so she manipulated Cypher into releasing Delling and coming back to Galbadia. The fallout from the TV station debacle was immediate. The Forest Owl's base was attacked and destroyed by the Galbadian military, and the unfortunate Seed who had been in the wrong location at the wrong time were all branded as fugitives in the eyes of the Galbadian occupying force. With their options now limited due to no fault of their own, Quistis ordered her ragtag group of novice Seed to follow the Garden Protocol. As they had no way back to their own home, they were to seek refuge in the closest allied facility, which was none other than Galbadia Garden itself. Such a course of action should have played them right into the hands of a furious Vinza Delling. But back in Galbadia, the arrival of Adia had continued to create divisions, and thanks to the efforts of the now very paranoid Fury Caraway, Galbadia Garden had been purposely isolated from the Galbadian military. Fury's distrust of the Sorceress had grown to new heights. His close friend and ally, Vinza Delling, was acting in ways that were completely against his true nature and character, and it led to Fury settling on the one logical conclusion, that Delling was no longer in control of his actions. In all their years, Vinza had always ruled through fear. Manipulations and subterfuge had only been applied to politics, where allies and citizens needed to be bribed and cajoled. When it came to the military, there had never been any talk of peace with neighbouring states. Once the decision of conquest or expansion had been made, they were always only given two options: surrender and willingly become part of the Galbadian Empire, or resist and be subjugated. The notion of this global peace forum just served as the final piece of evidence to Fury that Vinza was no longer in control. He still had no idea how the Sorceress was doing it, be it through magic or pure blackmail, but it didn't matter. He knew that she needed to be removed, and Garden was the perfect vessel to see this done. Ever since its founding, Galbadia Garden had always been treated as a subdivision of the military. It was still under the tentative control of Fury, but most of the other military personnel ignored it, choosing to focus their efforts on more established branches, as they ultimately just saw Garden as a training ground for kids. But Fury knew better. He knew of the talent housed within, and trusted them to complete what was tantamount to an inside job. But he wasn't alone in this endeavour. Behind Sid's back, Nord had shown his truly duplicitous nature by becoming quite cosy with his Galbadian counterparts. They had come to an arrangement, and this meant they were happy to work with Norg on cementing suitable deals that were good for business, as opposed to working towards any of the initial ideals that Sid had for Garden. Whereas Caraway was concerned about the fate of his good friend Vinza Delling, Norg was concerned that the Sorceress may threaten his very profitable institution. So, collectively, they agreed to assassinate Adia as it was mutually beneficial for all of them. Due to the nature of the initiative, Caraway and Galbadia Garden's headmaster, Martine, took great effort to keep the order a secret. But with everything happening on their continent and means of communication cut, they decided to alter the plan behind Norg's back, as they wanted plausible deniability. So, instead of using a selection of Galbadia Garden operatives to carry out the deed, they chose to use the well-known fugitive operatives from Balam Garden who had just turned up on their doorstep as the muscle. Galbadia's only involvement was to use Irvine, a master sharpshooter. By taking this approach to outside world, it would look as though Balam Garden sanctioned the mission, not Galbadia, and this was an important distinction. Armed with their new sharpshooter ally, the Balam Seed operatives then made their way to Delling City, where they made secret contact with Caraway. He briefed them on the final aspects of the mission, as well as the contingency plans. It seemed that every precaution had been taken to ensure the mission's success, but once it started, things went sideways. Rinoa proved to be very much Cypher's soulmate. Having become frustrated yet again by her father's behaviour towards her, she acted on impulse. Wanting to prove that she was just as capable as the Seed operatives, she snatched an Odin bangle, which was said to be able to suppress the powers of a sorceress, and escape from her father's intended prison. Her plan predictably failed, but it made an already stressful situation for the Seed much more stressful. Quistis, Zell, and Selphie almost missed their planned rendezvous point, and Squall was required to then save Rinoa from almost certain death. Despite these distractions, though, the mission did proceed almost as planned, but as it played out, the situation started to become more dire. Continuing to use Adia as a vessel, Ultimecia had whipped the citizens of Delling City into a frenzied state of support, and with her original plans for peace talks shattered, she took the next best course of action. In front of everyone, Ultimecia used Adia to murder Vinza Delling, and with nobody left to oppose her, she assumed full power of Galbadia. This turn of events meant the successful completion of the mission became even more imperative. All that remained was for Irvine to take the shot. Unbeknownst to the rest of the team, however, Irvine was suffering from a severe psychological condition known as anticipatory moral distress. Unlike everyone else who was assigned to the mission, Irvine had never had any exposure to Guardian forces. He remembered who they all were, owing to their time together at the orphanage, and he most certainly remembered who Adia was. What was being asked of him was akin to murdering his own mother. Yet, this wasn't the woman he knew. The calm, caring matron would never hurt anyone, let alone murder the ruler of an entire nation in front of a frenzied crowd. In the midst of all the chaos, Irvine resolved to take the shot. But despite having the perfect aim, the bullet was stopped dead in its tracks, as though it was nothing more than a nuisance. Almost as soon as Plan A failed, Plan B was then put into action. Unlike Irvine, Squall had a clean conscience. He was unconcerned about the politics or the moral implications of what was being asked. He had been given a mission and was going to carry it out to the best of his abilities. And with Cypher now involved, Squall only became more motivated. Leaving Irvine behind, Squall jumped down from their vantage point, commandeered a car, and headed straight for the Sorceress. He planned to execute her, and if need be, Cypher too. Though the battle was bitter, this time Squall managed to get the better of his longtime rival and nearly bested Adia with the help of his comrades, but their efforts were in vain. The possessed Adia was simply far too powerful for this rookie seed team, and she used her vast magical powers to cast them aside. This brief skirmish represented Ultimecia's first encounter with the original incarnation of Seed, and she found them wanting, especially in comparison to the Seed that she had come to know from her own timeline. She could have eradicated them there and then, but they were spared due to her curiosity. Ultimecia had never quite understood why Seed was established, or why they were so hell-bent on destroying sorceresses. Now, having a small group of them captured, she had the chance to procure some answers, and hoped to extract information from these young charges before casting them aside. The capturing of the Seed operatives was just the latest step in Ultimecia's ever-evolving plan. The main objective was still the same, find Alone and coerce her. But ever since Cypher's erratic actions at the Timber television station, Ultimecia had been forced to adapt. She had hoped that the promise of peace would make it easy for her to manipulate the world's most powerful leaders into letting her use their resources to try and find Alone. But following Cypher's actions, Galbadia's opponents were understandably unimpressed and were unwilling to step up to the negotiating table. The next best thing was therefore seizing control of Galbadia itself. Ultimecia had only deemed Vinza Delling necessary for her original plan, as she needed him to vouch for Adia. But with foreign affairs no longer on the menu, Vinza Delling was discarded, and Ultimecia, via Adia, declared herself the new ruler. Those left in Galbadia, including the likes of Fury Caraway, were left with no choice but to fall in line, if they valued their lives. His attempt to restore the power dynamic that existed before the appearance of Adia had failed, but Caraway's contingency plan had worked. Irvine managed to escape from the scene without being captured, and Balam Garden was framed. The only annoyance was that Rinoa had incriminated herself. But the focus on Balam gave Caraway the breathing room he needed to sidle up to the new leader, as he wanted to ensure his head was not the next one on the chopping block, and he was even able to sweet-talk the release of his daughter. What Ultimecia needed was loyalty, and even though the reach of Galbadia wasn't as broad, the nation was still a venerable superpower, and its resources were near unrivaled. She needed people like Caraway to carry out her plan. And this notion was only furthered once Caraway informed Adia that they had a seldom used branch of the military that could be activated to help their cause, Garden. This then became an ironic twist. Garden under the control of a sorceress. And it was perhaps for this reason that Ultimecia decided to deviate from her primary objective by introducing a few secondary ones. The first was to try and find out everything she could about Seed before then implementing the second, the complete and utter annihilation of the entire organisation and all of its operatives. As the military started to mobilise in search of a loan, Cypher, who had been promoted to commander of the Galbadian military, was given the task of interrogating his former allies inside the D-District prison. But the questions didn't seem to make much sense to him. Ultimecia had always believed that there was some huge conspiracy against sorceresses, and this is what fueled Seed. She ordered Cypher to try and uncover the secrets of the organisation, but the truth was, there weren't any. Ultimately, Seed had been set up to stop one specific sorceress, but there was no way for Squall to know that or any other member of Seed, as Adir and Sid had never shared the truth about Seed or Garden with anyone. Cypher had a sense that he was barking up the wrong tree, but as he had failed the Seed exam, part of him wanted to believe that there was some big secret that was passed on to new graduates, and so he started to believe Ultimecia's line of thinking, that there was a huge conspiracy and that Squall, his longtime rival, wasn't telling the truth out of spite. He probably was lying. Not wanting to fail in his task, Cypher was diligent with his torture. It was therefore quite fortunate that Squall and the other Seed operatives held in the prison were able to escape through a combination of quick thinking and good luck. It was through their escape, though, that the group were able to learn of Ultimecia's wider plans. As to enact her secondary objective, she wanted to use a nearby facility to fire high-tech, ultra-long-range missiles to destroy both Trabia and Balam Garden, with the official line given that this was to be retribution for their role in the failed assassination attempt. This placed the small group of fugitive Seed in a precarious position. They each had people they loved and cared about that were stationed at Trabia and Balam, but how could they save everyone? Knowing this, the choice was made to send one party, led by Squall, to Balam Garden to warn Sid so that the students and Seed could be safely evacuated, while another, led by Selphie, went to the missile base, attempting to sabotage the launch and hoping to stop it altogether if possible. Unfortunately, though Selphie's party was successful in infiltrating the base, they were unable to stop Galbadia firing on Trabia or Balam. They just had to hope that everyone was able to stay safe despite the obvious peril they faced. Trabia Garden unfortunately took the full force of the missile strike, but at Balam Garden, due to the obvious peril they faced, everything was in complete chaos. News of Seed's involvement in the failed assassination plot against Adir had reached the ears of Norg, and he was incensed, not only because the plan had failed, but because he had been double-crossed by Martine and Caraway, and his involvement had been revealed. To protect his asset and save his skin, Norg felt there was only one choice: hand over Sid and anyone else she felt was responsible, hope the sorceress's anger was quelled, and then pretend to be subservient. Norg ordered the students and faculty of Balam Garden to find Sid. He expected them to turn on their phony headmaster due to the predicament that they had been placed in. But large portions of the student body showed loyalty to Sid, and the wider mission of standing up to sorceresses. They weren't going to bow down, and this surprised and antagonized Norg and the Garden faculty. Some students did, though, side with Norg, and the result was an all-out civil war, with those loyal to Sid desperate to keep him safe away from the clutches of Norg. Unaware of this development, when Squall and his party arrived at Balam Garden, they found it in a state of chaos. Everywhere they turned, students were fighting students, and faculty were rounding up Seed members by using monsters from the Garden's training center. Fighting through the Garden, Squall did manage to find Sid, but this was where he learned that communicating Garden's imminent destruction was impossible, as the internal communication system was broken. Just when it looked like there was no way out, the Garden was doomed, Sid then revealed a hunch. As Balam Garden was built on the ruins of an old Centran shelter, Sid surmised that it contained some kind of defensive mechanism that was designed to protect its inhabitants when the need arose. Much to everyone's surprise, the defensive mechanism was mobility. And just as it had saved the Centra many centuries prior as they attempted to flee from the cataclysmic lunar cry, it performed the same function again, this time ensuring Garden narrowly avoided the Galbadian missile strike. This was not the end of Balam Garden's trouble, though. The mechanism that controlled the Garden's steering was broken, and this meant no course could be plotted. To make matters worse, Norg, whose takeover attempt had been temporarily stalled but not snuffed out, began to have it out with Sid, going so far as to take matters into his own hands and attempt to deliver Sid and Seed to Galbadia himself. This proved to be one step too far though. Having cajoled Cid all those years ago and then manipulated him, Norg felt he was near invincible. After all, he had amassed a private army across 3 separate continents. But now, Norg's empire was in ruins, literally and figuratively. Trebia Garden had been destroyed by the Galbadian missile strike, while Galbadia Garden had claimed independence. Balam was also in disarray, and now that the infighting had stopped, only the Garden faculty remained loyal to their paymaster. Norg's feeble attempts to try and wrestle back control had ended in disaster, and after then being defeated in his last stand, he ended up fleeing inside a protective capsule, hoping that somehow he survived the coming war. This sequence of events, though, also showed the ruthlessness of Ultimecia. Within a short time period, she had subdued one of the most powerful nations on the planet and attempted to eradicate who she perceived to be the main source of opposition in this timeline. But it also showed that Ultimecia was erratic and unpredictable. Almost as soon as Adia had started to act in unorthodox ways, the White Seed had attempted to mitigate that risk. With haste, they shipped Alone away, and the location was purposeful. Balam Garden was the closest thing to an anti-sorceress stronghold that existed in the world. Out of the 3 garden installations, it housed the most competent and experienced individuals, and they were there in their greatest numbers. The White Seed hoped, therefore, that it was the safest place for Alone should anyone try to take her by force. But what they hadn't expected was the extreme nature of assault that Garden was subjected to, at the whim of Ultimecia. Had they taken Alone to Trebia Garden instead, due to its remoteness, she would now have likely been dead. And it was only by some miracle that she and Balam Garden had managed to survive a similar fate. However, the White Seed didn't want to put their hands in fate again. Balam Garden had survived one assault, but they surmised that there would likely be others. So they decided to remove Alone from the firing line, returning her to the White Seed ship and the anonymity the vessel granted. Their prediction then turned out to be true, as Balam Garden and indeed Squall were soon to face their greatest ever test. After defeating Norg, Squall had been left overwhelmed by everything that had transpired. He had gone from a relatively normal life where he had attended a military academy for years and just graduated, to being a reluctant part in a resistance movement, to becoming an assassin and then a wanted fugitive. And to top everything out, he found out that the person he believed was running Garden wasn't even running it at all. Everything was just a scam. To make matters worse, without any prior warning and with plenty of more qualified candidates available, Cid then decided to make Squall the spokesperson for Balam Garden, forcing him to apologise for an incident involving Fisherman's Horizon that was completely outside of his control. But what Squall failed to realise, as Cid had never imparted this knowledge, was that since that fateful day, a decade prior, Squall had been groomed for this moment. Cid and Adia always knew that the fate of the world was in Squall's hands. They didn't quite know how or when he may be needed, so all they could do was try their best to make sure he was ready. And that's all Cid had ever tried to do. Now, with full control of the Garden following the demise of Norg, it led to Cid taking a decisive piece of action. Shocking the entire institute, Cid resigned as headmaster over the Garden's intercom and announced that he would be placing Squall in charge as the Garden's new commander. Without too much time to settle into the role, Squall was then forced to face destiny. Galbadia Garden had mobilised and was now under the full control of Adia via Ultimecia, and they were ready for war. And this news was complicated by their own recent discovery, as the true identity of the Sorceress and their connection had been revealed to them. Squall, however, realised that the battle was inevitable, and if he didn't step into the role of leader, people may die, irrespective of who the Sorceress was. So he sprung into action, assigning squads to defensive duties and getting everyone as prepared for battle as they could be, given the circumstances. When the two gardens collided, the fighting was unlike anything either side had ever seen, even when taking into account the internal struggle against Norg or the invasion of Dolet. It seemed everywhere one turned, students from both gardens, supplemented by Seed operatives and Galbadian soldiers, were locked in life or death struggles, all while the Sorceress and her knight watched from above. Squall and Renoa had their own life or death struggle, but after they resolved this and fought their way through the battlefield, they came face to face with the Sorceress once again. Filled with conviction that this was the final battle, Squall had no intention of this second encounter with the Sorceress turning out the same as the first. Stronger and wiser than his previous attempt, he locked into combat with Cypher, and the two engaged in yet another bitter gunblade struggle. Though no easy task, Cypher was defeated again, but it was during this time that Ultimecia realised something. The seed that stood before her was the one destined to stop her. Unlike their last encounter, where Ultimecia had ultimately spared the pesky seed with the hopes of extracting useful information, this time she vowed to kill. But they braved Idia's strongest magic and used their years of training to bring down their former matron, trying as hard as they could to hold back where possible so as to not kill her outright. In Idia's defeat, she was freed from the grasp of Ultimecia's possession, but due to how close she had come to death, the process of embodiment then occurred, and with Rinoa being the only suitable nearby candidate, she was forced to accept both the powers of Idia's sorceress lineage, but also Ultimecia's. Upon receiving this power, Rinoa was understandably overwhelmed. The sensation was nothing like she had ever experienced before, and she was unprepared. But just before she fainted, Ultimecia was able to implement a Hail Mary play. Idia was no longer a viable target for her schemes, as the embodiment process had neutered her, but Rinoa was a ready-made replacement who was younger and more susceptible. This trade-off required a pivot. With Idia indisposed, Ultimecia's grip over Galbadia had the potential to be weakened, but it wasn't removed yet. If they could keep the demise of Idia secret, Cypher, who still had absolute authority over the Galbadian military, could continue to use the nation's vast resources to enact a new plan, one that required the rehabilitation of another sorceress from this timeline, and the subsequent implementation of a shock and awe campaign designed to flush Alone out. Using Rinoa as a vessel, Ultimecia communicated her plan to Cypher, giving him explicit instructions to use the Galbadian military to find and restore the lunatic Pandora, so that Adele's tomb could be brought back to the planet, while also using their information network to find Alone. And to ensure this plan went off without a hitch, Ultimecia then relinquished control of Rinoa, lulling everyone into a false sense of security and ensuring they became unwitting pawns in her ever-evolving scheme. Chapter 9. The Fight for the Future. In the wake of the conflict between Galbadia and Balam Garden, Squall and the other remaining members of Seed were left with many unanswered questions, but they were also left reeling by what had happened to Rinoa, who was now in a comatose state. Based on the answers that were now forthcoming from Idia and Sid, there seemed to be only one course of action. They needed to seek out Alone too. Unfortunately, this had been further complicated by a dormant player on the world scale deciding to become active again. After becoming president of Esther, Laguna had done everything he could to ensure the nation's people stayed safe and out of harm's way. But when it came to the safety of his own family, he was forced to take another course of action, keeping them at arm's length so the likes of Dr. Odin could not sink their grubby claws in. The Kramers had been a fantastic ally in this regard, acting as the perfect shield. But as Ultimecia started to narrow in on Alone, Laguna decided to take matters into his own hands. After all, Esther was perhaps more equipped to deal with an angry sorceress than any other nation on the planet, and with a more pressing threat looming on the horizon, Dr. Odin was also suitably distracted away from his daughter. Despite being isolated from society, it's safe to assume that Esther still had spies operating in the world. And it's also safe to assume that those spies would have reported back to Laguna the increased further around Galbadia's hunt for a girl named Alone. Galbadia knew that Alone had been in Balam, but they also became aware of the White Seed ship's true purpose. And shortly after the White Seed had rescued Alone from Balam Garden, they were accosted by the Galbadian navy. Everything looked quite bleak. That was until ships from the Astarian navy showed up on the scene, with Alone then abandoning the White Seed to go back to Esther and to her father. On the surface, this decision by Alone complicated things, but it felt like a necessary step to guarantee her safety. The downside was that it played directly into the hands of Ultimecia. The first part of her shock and awe campaign was focused around making life as difficult for Alone as possible. They wanted to give her nowhere to hide, and likely predicted that if times got super tough, she would go all the way back home to Daddy. But this was where Ultimecia also needed her sleeper agent Rinoa to be. As if they were moths drawn to a flame, all the key players gravitated into space towards Adele, the very person Ultimecia needed for the next part of her plan. Meanwhile, back on the surface of the planet, the rest of Ultimecia's plan was also progressing as intended. Under the supervision of Cypher, the Galbadian military had managed to excavate the lunatic Pandora from the depths of the ocean and proceeded to steer it straight towards Tyr's Point, ready and waiting to receive their prize. Everything was playing out as Ultimecia had foreseen, and with Rinoa now on the space station, the sleeper agent was activated. Now possessed, Rinoa escaped from the space station and released the seal of Adele's tomb, with the ground forces then activating the lunatic Pandora to bring the tomb back to the planet. Everything went off without a hitch, or so it seemed, but something happened that Ultimecia had not anticipated. That pesky seed, that one who was destined to stop her, risked his own life to save Rinoa. What followed turned out to be an emotional rollercoaster for the pair as they made their way back to the planet, only for Rinoa to be seized by Astarian forces due to her designation as a sorceress. But this was when Squall stepped up to the plate. He had sacrificed so much for Rinoa, but for what? So she could willingly be taken into custody as punishment for something she had no control over? The path forward was difficult to navigate, but the more and more Squall ruminated on the task at hand, the more and more something didn't feel right. He had to save Rinoa. No matter what, he had to become her knight. Rushing to catch Rinoa and her Astarian escort at the Sorceress Memorial, Squall took Rinoa by force before fleeing in the Ragnarok back to Adir's orphanage. Here, Squall and Rinoa were able to finally connect on everything that had happened to them and everything that still lay before them. But Cypher was still out there doing Ultimecia's bidding. A Lunacry had fallen in the eastern continent, and Esther was soon to be in the hands of Ultimecia. Everything looked bleak, but what they didn't realise was that brighter minds had been formulating a plan that was only possible due to Squall's noble actions in space. Returning to Esther, Laguna and Squall met formally for the first time. But there was no time for the two to get acquainted and talk about the many things they no doubt needed to discuss. After all, Ultimecia's existential threat to the world loomed large, and to make matters worse, Galbadia had captured Alone, as they were the first to get to the scene of her rescue pod. It meant that in order to stop Ultimecia and put an end to her schemes once and for all, they were going to need to go on the offensive. But it just so happened that Laguna and Odin had formulated a plan, and what a plan it was. The main issue posed by their antagonist was that unlike previous sorceresses who were there as physical beings, Ultimecia was working from the future via proxies. And due to her being grounded in the future, there was no way of making direct contact with her, lest they somehow invent the ability to travel forward in time. There was also the added peril of people having to fight against people they cared about, knowing that even though they weren't in control of their actions, the consequences were still very real. As long as Ultimecia had the junction machine alone in the future, her reign of terror could persist, and her quest to cast time compression was a matter of when, rather than if. It was for this reason that the decision was made to take some drastic action. Because they believed Ultimecia's success was essentially inevitable, Laguna and Dr. Odin theorized, thanks to their conversations with Adir, that they needed to use this to their advantage. They believed that if they just let Ultimecia cast time compression, they could manipulate its effect and send their chosen champions to the same point in time. It was simple in theory, but there were so many parts that could go wrong, and by giving Ultimecia what she wanted, they had the potential to fly too close to the sun. Their objectives were therefore to rescue Alone, defeat the still subdued Adele, and have Rinoa absorb Adele's powers. They believed this would leave Rinoa as the only known sorceress in that time, giving Ultimecia limited options. When Ultimecia then possessed Rinoa, Alone was instructed to send them both into the past, allowing Ultimecia to initiate the spell. But this was when they would pull the rug out from beneath their nemesis, as Alone would sever the connection with Ultimecia, leaving the spell incomplete. Though time compression would be cast, the crucial difference was that they would be in control of events, and not Ultimecia. There was just one complication. Adele had already awoken from her slumber, and had been possessed by Ultimecia, who had instructed a bewildered and lost Cypher to kidnap Rinoa. Breaking into the lunatic Pandora, the C-Team sought to enact their plan, but that was when they found a desperate and deranged Cypher in their way. His typical bravado was gone, replaced instead by a bullish confidence. Cypher was no longer living the dream of a knight, and his closest friends had abandoned him. The only thing left he had was personal pride. Cypher mustered up the strength to defeat Odin, but after he was then swept away by Gilgamesh, it was just another reality check. But that just focused him on achieving his actual objective, capturing Rinoa, his former flame, and taking her to Ultimecia like the lapdog he had become. This turn of events was not in the original plan that Laguna and Odin had laid out, and Squall and the other Seed members quickly found themselves improvising in order to get things back on track. Not least because they then had to witness the now-possessed Adele junction Rinoa to her own body as a way of augmenting and amplifying her powers. What followed was a fierce and also precarious battle. Adele needed to be defeated quickly before she regained her full power without hurting Rinoa in the process. Fortunately, they were able to accomplish this objective, and with Adele defeated, Rinoa was able to absorb her powers through the process of embodiment. The mission was back on track, if only by the skin of its teeth. But there was no time to celebrate the victory. Working fast, as soon as Ultimecia then possessed Rinoa, Alone carried out her part of the plan, sending Ultimecia back far enough into the past so that she could initiate the casting of time compression, before then severing the connection before the casting was complete. This led to reality seemingly falling apart, with fragments of time bubbling and moving about as if everything had become twisted and warped. Falling through an ocean and then a sky, the heroes proceeded to fight their way through a myriad of time phantoms and sorceresses from the past, present and future before finding themselves at Idia's orphanage, the place where they all met all those years ago. As if in a nightmare though, the beach of the orphanage was suddenly not the vista they remembered, but instead the site of a great struggle between Seed and Ultimecia, with the bodies of Seed operatives strewn about and Ultimecia's castle looming in the distance. Against all odds, they had arrived right where they needed to be, and one way or another, it would lead to the end. Ultimecia's castle was a place befitting of her dark and twisted mind. A decrepit, crumbling, and dark place, it was filled with the most powerful monsters Ultimecia could summon, including some guardian forces she had twisted into macabre renditions of themselves to serve as guardians for her. Ultimecia had gone out of her way to make sure that anyone attempting to interfere with her plans would have to deal with the multitude of magical and physical seals she put on the castle, and those obstacles kept away many would-be heroes. But the Seed from the past were different. They traversed Ultimecia's castle, defeating the guardians of her seals one by one before making their way into her throne room. Ultimecia, while annoyed by this turn of events, had also expected something similar. This was, after all, a fated encounter against Seed, who were destined to thwart her plans. But she felt she was ready to alter her fate. Ultimecia was well versed in the ways of magic and combat, having spent her entire life fighting to survive. And even though the enemy she feared most was now at her doorstep, there was no way she had any intention of letting them stop her from remaking the universe in her image. If there was one thing that Ultimecia's bleak existence had instilled in her psyche, it was the fear of death, and that fear had given rise to not only her immense power and ability, but also a desire to revert all of existence to its original form before shaping it into one of her own choosing, as Hein had done before. In defeating Seed and time itself, Ultimecia hoped to conquer the very forces she felt were working towards her destruction, and all of her actions were essentially ones born out of a deep-seated fear and trauma. But there was also a personal angle now. The particular Seed that stood before Ultimecia were more pesky and troublesome, and so, just like any good villain worth their salt would do, Ultimecia felt compelled to alter her plan, promising to enslave this particular group in time for their troubles. And thus, the fight for the future commenced. As a sorceress, Ultimecia was one of the strongest that the world had ever seen. In her basic form, she posed a formidable challenge, but her true power lay beyond her human form, and as the battle wore on, Ultimecia became more and more monstrous, tapping deeper and deeper into her well of arcane magic in order to bring an end to her enterprising intruders. Squall, for his part, was resolute in his determination to bring Ultimecia down, but unknown to him, she had a clever trick waiting in the wings. Summoning a guardian force known as Griever, made from Squall's own mind of the most powerful being he could imagine, she set the monster on the party in her stead. And just when Squall had thought his worst enemy bested, Ultimecia then took it a step further. She junctioned herself onto Griever, enhancing its power even further. As the battle wore on, Squall and his companions were growing ever more weary, but they were also wearing Ultimecia down too. Though to them, this progress was hard to notice, Ultimecia was growing ever more desperate and afraid, and even she found it was harder and harder to keep up with their assault. Suddenly, Ultimecia then disappeared. Lulled into a false sense of victory, all seemed to be going well, but then she reappeared in her most horrible form yet. With her human form hanging upside down from her torso, Ultimecia had transformed herself into a vision of pure terror and magic. Pushed to the brink, she was going to dig deeper than she ever had done before and force time to finish compressing. Her last-ditch effort to defeat Seed was to force the end of time and reset existence. In this form, Ultimecia in many ways took on an appearance reminiscent of the Great Hein, who had likewise cast aside his human skin at one point to embody his true power. But though Ultimecia was a descendant of Hein by lineage of sorceresses, she was not yet a god, despite her efforts, and Squall saw his final and true form of her power as the final opportunity to defeat her. And defeat her he did. With each crushing blow, Squall fought through Ultimecia's onslaught as her once arrogant taunting turned into regretful reflection of the nature of time and existence and the inevitability of one's own demise. The next phase, however, was to be the most difficult. Odin had theorized that once Ultimecia was defeated, the time compression spell would begin to unravel. To ensure they were not lost, each of the members who fought this battle needed to ground themselves somehow, to find their way back home. But as a final throw of the dice, Ultimecia was able to separate Squall from his friends and disorientate him. It was at this moment that Squall suddenly found himself, alongside Ultimecia, back in Adia's orphanage from all those years ago. The time had finally come for him to live the very event that had fated him to travel the path he had with Seed, the garden, all his friends, and Rinoa. Appearing to Adia as she recounted to him, Squall watched as Adia took Ultimecia's powers, her dying words a furtive wish to not disappear. Squall then informed Adia of Seed, the garden, and the Sorceress before going back through the time anomaly, leaving Adia with a plan to protect the future. Ultimecia was now defeated for certain, that he could be sure, but this course had left him alone, lost and out of sync with time. He had become separated from the others and felt more alone than he ever had in his entire life. Squall had lived most of his life putting up barriers to others and acting as though he didn't need anyone else in the world. But through his adventures with his friends and through his relationship with Rinoa, he now knew differently. He knew there were people out there who cared for him deeply, and he knew they were looking for him. All he had to do was call out. Searching through the wastes of a land between space and time, Squall wandered and wandered for what felt like aeons before collapsing. Scenes of Rinoa playing in his mind. Would he ever be able to find his way back? He had to believe. Then, as if out of nowhere, Rinoa appeared. Feeling Squall through time, she used her powers to reach out and cradle him, bringing him back to reality and reuniting him with the others in the now restored timeline. They had travelled through time, defeated the Sorceress, and survived time compression. Seed had won, and the threat of Adele, Vinzadeling, and Ultimecia was now gone from the world. And that concludes the complete, unabridged timeline of Final Fantasy VIII. My name is Darryl, and I would like to thank you all so much for watching. Honestly, reading through the comments as this series has progressed has been so heartwarming. This was a new type of video for us, but it's been so great to see how much it has resonated with all of you. I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who has stayed with us until the end, especially those who chose to support us on Patreon as a way of saying thank you for us creating this type of content. Now, to the important question. We'd like you to let us know in the comments which game you'd like us to cover the timeline of next. And if you did enjoy this series, please make sure you like all the videos, subscribe to the channel, but also make sure to hit the notification bell so you're informed when we post up our next timeline video. In short, any interactions you make are very helpful. I'd also like to give a big shout out to Benjamin Snow, CloudClone28, the livestream, and SequentDDK, our super special Onion Knight supporters on Patreon, as well as everyone else who supports us on Patreon and via YouTube memberships. Alright everyone, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.